Hello, this is Minger Chen. I'm professor of Management Information Systems at Smith School of Business Economics at CSU Channel Island. This is our second lecture on decision making. Under the POLC framework, decision making or making decision is part of the leading function, which can be studied from the people's perspective. Also, we can analyze the decision from a process perspective, because making decision is not just a single point in time that you make a particular decision. You typically, as an individual or a group, you actually go through a process in making decisions. Last time we defined what decision making is, and also we study factors that affecting decision making. And we also introduce 4 major decision making models and describe some of the processes followed in each of the model. And we're going to continue in this lectures regarding first are the biases that cause faulty decision making, and then we're going to particularly paying attention in terms of creative problem solving in managerial decision making. In this case, problem-solving decision-making are very closely related to each other. So we cover this topic in this unit. And we'll touch base at the end, some issue related to group decision-making. And certainly when we talk about faulty decision-making, creative problem-solving, a lot of time the concepts model that we discuss can apply to individuals or to group. So let's jump to first the human biases, cognitive biases that we may have, which cause us to make faulty decisions. In the textbook, they list a few, but there are more, such as the one listed here. For instance, overconfidence. Study has shown that people usually predict their ability in making the right decision much higher than what they're really capable of. And hindsight, which is everybody can play the Monday morning quarterback to analyze various football strategies. So in hindsight, we can be all very smart in analyzing what a good decision or strategy is supposed to be, since we already know the facts. There are additional biases. You should study the textbook and search the web, including anchoring, framing biases, and also escalation of commitment. This is also this number 5, escalating commitment, is really related to sunk costs or sunk cost fallacy. Just because you already spent a lot of time, efforts, money in a particular alternative that you have chosen doesn't mean that you should continue spend more money in case you analyze the situation and found this alternative that you have already spent a lot of resource may not be a reasonable one, then it's time to cut it off. There are additional biases which we're not going to go through it in detail. A lot of them are really related to human cognition, a limitation of human cognitions. And for instance, confirmation biases, people tend to form opinion very quickly. Once they form the opinion without a lot of information, they tend to pay attention to the information that confirm what they believe, and ignore information that contradict what they believe. This is what we call confirmation bias. Let's move to an area which is very important. This is certainly related to decision making and also related to what we discussed before in terms of effective meeting. We mentioned facilitations. As a facilitator, a lot of time you guide people in meetings to solve problems, to make major decisions, such as formulating strategy for a company in a strategic meeting. And we will use something called creative problem solving. There's an acronym for it called CPS, to kind of describe the processes, stages in solving problem in a more creative way. Let me first give you the model that I use. It's a simplified model that I come up with, and it's really about generating ideas, organizing ideas, and evaluating ideas. Here I use alternative, which is really, you can consider that's ideas. So it's idea generation, idea organization, and idea evaluation. You can substitute the term idea to something else like issue generation, issue organization, issue evaluation. If you're assessing risk of investment, then you generate a list of risk. You've organized some of the risk that may be describing the same risk, and then you combine them and get rid of something which or combine several together, and to simplify the list. And eventually you will evaluate a number of risks and find out which ones may be the major one you have to deal with. If the idea you generate is not that many, you can jump right into the alternative evaluation. If you have generated lots of ideas, then you may need to go through this step called idea organization to consolidate. Basically consolidate, combine the ideas, and eventually go through the alternative evaluation. If you have many ideas, you may want to use some simple evaluation methods, such as rate the alternatives, and to come up with a shorter list, and then use a more serious decision-making tool or evaluation tool, such as multi-criteria decision-making. For instance, evaluate alternative based on cost, benefit, risk, etc., and to make your final choice or final choices. And in idea generation, brainstorming certainly is the most common technique that we use. In each of the stage, idea generation, idea organization, and idea or alternative evaluation, there can be multiple techniques in your toolbox that you can use. But whatever you generate as an output, like a list of ideas, will be served as an input to the next stage for the idea organizations. And the organized idea would be as an output from the second stage, will go to the alternative evaluation stage as an input. And eventually it will come up with your final choices. And when you follow this kind of three-step process, we started with divergent thinking, which means we'll try to come up with different alternatives in solving a problem. But once you have lots of ideas, then you need to move to another stage, which we call it convergent thinking, to combine some idea or evaluate and filter out less important ideas and eventually make a choice. The choice could be a merge of several ideas and integrate them together. So it's very important. If you look at this three-step process, it's very similar to something we call it divergent thinking and convergent thinking. You start with understand a problem, and eventually you would actually try to explore various possible solutions or ideas or alternatives. And after you come up with many of them, then you need to go to the next stage in terms of converge, or to zoom in and narrow down such that eventually you would have only one or fewer idea that you will pursue. This is the stage you decided what to do. That's convergent thinking. And wrote it here that the reason we emphasize this divergent thinking in the beginning of the creative problem solving is that a lot of experts believe that one way you can be more creative is don't fall in love with your first ideas. People tend to defend the idea they come up with, and particularly the first few ideas they came up with. And so in the early beginning of problem solving, you want to be open-minded, you want to explore many possibilities, but you cannot deal with all of them, all the ideas or possibility, and therefore you need this convergent thinking to combine the list, simplify the list, to evaluate the list, and then come up with the final solution. Okay, so a CPS is nothing difficult, but you do need to practice it in order to use it effectively once you know how to use it. Particularly in group meeting, this can be the framework for you to facilitate the group meeting as a creative problem solving process. And the three-stage kind of idea generation, idea organization, and alternative evaluation is a technique or process that you can use it repeatedly. This is what I meant. If you think about the problem-solving life cycle, I here use a simple one. You first identify problem or opportunity you want to pursue. I mean, although we call it creative problem solving, doesn't mean you always frame the issue as a problem. It could be like which opportunity we should pursue. You can do brainstorming on that, and then eventually make a choice of which, organizing those opportunities, combining them, and eventually you take a vote to evaluate the opportunity. Okay, so you identify problem or opportunity, you create or design solutions or alternative, and to solve the problem, and eventually you will come up, you need to implement the solution or system that you have chosen. In each of the life cycle stage, you can actually use idea generation, idea organization, alternative evaluation to identify problem. For instance, if you want to find out the root causes of a problem, you can run brainstorming. So what caused lower graduation rate at a university, and then you organize those reasons people come up with, and then you evaluate to see how which one considered are the important one. So that would be a three-step process to deal with identifying the root causes of a problem. And once you identify, let's say, a few key problems, and then you can actually go through kind of a design stage to design possible solution to deal with that. For instance, low graduation rate, and then you will say, okay, in order to solve that problem, in terms of student not prepared for some of the core courses, then you would go through this idea generation, idea organization, alternative evaluation, and you pose a question like, how can we better prepare students for some key core courses. Student, faculty member will come and generate ideas, and then somebody, particular facilitator, may come in, help the group to do the brainstorming and organize the idea being generated, and eventually choose an evaluation method to evaluate those ideas. And once you come up with maybe the top 3 ideas, then you can go through actually the next stage here to say, okay, if we know that better tutoring is the key potential, do not have enough tutoring service is a problem, so we need to come up with a better tutoring service. Then you need to actually do another kind of a brainstorming and idea generation, idea organization, and alternative evaluation to see how you're going to implement a better tutoring service at school. So again, you kind of repeat this idea generation, idea organization, alternative evaluation when you move along different stages in the problem-solving life cycle. Got it? It's very simple, but it's how you use it. If you use it wisely, you become a great facilitator. You can charge people a lot of money in providing professional facilitations services. In idea generation, as we mentioned briefly, brainstorming is a common technique people use, and it's part of creative decision-making or creative problem-solving. I prefer to refer this as a part of the creative problem-solving technique. And in this video that I use quite often, it's a design firm called Ideal. They were tasked by Nightline many years ago to design a shopping cart, and the recorded Nightline program recorded the whole experience. I strongly encourage you to watch this video. And in the video, you can see actually how they run brainstorming. They come up in Ideal, they have several rules to run brainstorming and some tips. The first 4 rules are very generic, which means everybody who know brainstorming know those are the 4 rules. The first is deferred judgment, which means that when you brainstorm idea, you don't evaluate or criticize people's idea in the brainstorming session. You will encourage people to come up with crazy, wild ideas, and you will go for quantity. Okay. And certainly some people say, why not go for quality? The reason is that when you focus on the quantity, you're not going to impose judgment on your own idea. You can say, oh, this is not a good idea, maybe I shouldn't say it. Whatever comes to your mind, just say it. Okay. So we encourage to go for quantity because we believe that with enough idea, there will be some good idea in it. And the 4th item here is build on the idea of others. Listen to others. So this is kind of in the group setting. Brainstorming, certainly you can do brainstorming yourself as an individual alone, but group brainstorming tends to be carried out by a group of people. So you want to build on the idea of others, combine idea of two ideas come from 2 individuals, and then come up with the 3rd ideas, which take the marry of both ideas and create something new. So once again, the 4 basic rules: defer judgment, encourage wild ideas, go for quantity, and build on the idea of others. Ideal has a few other rules. Watch the video once again. You may have a better understanding of some of the rules here. One conversation at a time. As a facilitator, you want to control the discussion, so only one person speak at a time. And also, ask them to stay focused on the topic so they don't sidetrack and then wandering off to something else irrelevant to the issue under discussions. And they used a lot of visual tools, flip chart, post-it notes, and sometimes even prototype. They will write down the idea that has been generated on, say, the flip charts, or write it on little post-it notes and then post it somewhere on the wall. And because the public display of those ideas give people a sense of achievement, and also we can easily point out some idea that has been already been stated, so that when people try to repeat it, you can kind of gently point it out. So we're not going to waste the time to go back to the same issue or ideas again and again. One tips on brainstorming is that try to formulate your brainstorming triggering question. Sometimes we call it triggering question. Very carefully. You don't want your question to be too open-minded, like how can we make the Smith School a better school? Certainly that it's a valid question, but it may be too broad. But at the same time, you don't want your brainstorming question to be too narrow. That would limit people's innovation. So it's somewhere in between, not too broad, not too narrow in terms of the scope of the question. When you run brainstormings and you come up with different ideas, then we can actually use the following criteria or instruments to measure creativity. And one is fluency, which means how many response or idea that you come up with. Second is flexibility, how many type of responses. And we're looking at variety. The ideas should be different from each other, not just the quantity. The fluency is really purely about quantity, okay? And flexibility really is about variety, how many types of response. And then we're looking for uniqueness, which we call it originality, which means the unusualness of the response that's kind of unusual. And that's usually a more creative one. In our textbook, I think they only mentioned the first three. In some other study, people also use elaboration, which means the idea or the response has been well thought out and very detailed. This may not that much related to creativity, but it's still indication of the creativity of a person in terms of how elaborate they are in coming up with a response. The whole movement of creative problem solving and also brainstorming was promoted in the early days by Alex Osborne, who worked for a marketing agency, wrote a book called Apply Imagination. Subtitle is Principle and Procedure of Creative Problem Solving, CPS. It was published in 1953, so it's almost 60-some years now. Osborne was the first to write about practical application of brainstorming and also CPS. And this is his process model. Fact finding, idea finding, and solution finding. And this three stage can expand it to problem definition, preparation, idea, production, which is certainly related, idea development, that's still related to idea finding, and eventually evaluate ideas and then adopt the idea that has been rated or ranked or evaluated highly. Okay. Here's the further description of some of the stages, 6 stages listed here. So from 3, we break it down to 2 each, and eventually this is the analysis or further description of each of the stage. Additional scholar and researcher practitioner has further developed the CPS model. So this is just one of the versions. We're not going to go through it in detail, but it has 6 stages, like objective finding. What's objective? And then facts finding. So earliest model doesn't have this objective finding. We may have facts finding, and there's a problem solving stage, idea findings, solution finding, and acceptance finding. In each stage, there is a diamond shape, which means divergent and convergence. Find as many objectives possible, but then narrow it down to few. Same thing, find lots of facts, but then narrow down to the major facts that's relevant to what you're working on. So pretty much we're going through this divergent, convergent, divergent, and convergent, from objective finding, facts finding, to problem finding, idea finding, solution finding, and acceptance finding. In a research conducted by Teresa Amabelli from Harvard, and the article is called "How to Kill Creativity." And certainly, if you read the article, it really tries to teach you how not to kill creativity in an organization. So her research is primarily creativity, in this case, regarding in the organizational context, which means organizational creativity. And Mbali actually identified 3 key components that affect creativity. One is certainly the creative thinking skill, like CPS, brainstorming skill, facilitations. Second is the expertise, technical know-how, expertise, procedure expertise, etc., about the problem that we're dealing with. The third component is motivation. In this case, once again, we found that intrinsic motivation is more effective than extrinsic one. And certainly the passion, interest that you have also contributed to the creativity level. So once again, it's creative thinking skill, it's the expertise, and then the motivation that contribute to creativity of an individual or a group, and in this case, of an organization. So in the same article, the author argued that how we should go about in managing creativity in an organization. Give people challenge work, but also give them freedom in tackle these challenges. Provide them with adequate resources, and make sure that you form teams or work group properly, so they're equipped enough resources and incentive to tackle problem. Constantly, as a supervisor, manager, and leader, encourage people working on project to be creative, and do provide additional organizational support. Next, we're going to just talk briefly about group decision making. A lot of decisions nowadays are made by group in teams. So understand how to work with group people smoothly in identifying problem, making decisions, are critical. One reason we want to have the group involved in the decision making because you can get buy-in more easily because people are involved in the process. They feel that they own the problem, therefore they will be more supportive if they are involved in the decision-making process. And if you can run very effective group decision makings activity, people will be more enjoyable working in teams, and certainly they have more invested in the decision. They tend to be more supportive of the final decision. Here's just a little bit comparison in terms of individual decision making, group decision making, in terms of pro and con. We're not going to go through the list here. Basically, certainly if you make individual decision, you're the only one, so you can quickly make decision without dragging on. For group decision making, it's much more complicated. There's conflict, so it takes longer time to make the decision. That's the disadvantage of group decision making. And however, if you have a group of people with complementary skill set, then you will have that diversity that you probably will come up with better idea than just have a single individual working on the problem. When group make decision, I think we mentioned this term earlier in another unit called groupthink. Groupthink is really a psychological phenomenon that when a group of people they care so much about harmony in the group or conformity in the group, it most likely it would result in an irrational and dysfunctional decision-making outcome. And because group members try to minimize conflict and try to reach a consensus decision, tends to come to some conclusion without critical thinking or critical evaluation of various alternative or viewpoint, and therefore they may not make the right decisions. And a lot of time the group thing may be caused by group pressures for conformity, and that certainly will increase the risk of group decision making flawed, and so we have to figure out a way to prevent groupthink in group decision making. And here's an article, and this list in terms of symptom of groupthink is listed, can be found in Wikipedia under groupthink. And for instance, we're not going to go through this list, but for instance, self-censorships. A lot of time in group, we don't want to upset other people, particularly our boss or good colleague. So when we come up with some idea which may not seems to be something that the group may agree, but they strongly think it's maybe a good idea, a lot of time we would self-censor ourselves and just, the group will get upset. We've been come to almost to a conclusion. Now I have come up with a great idea. If I said it, I may be blamed for not saying it earlier, so maybe I shouldn't say it. So that kind of self-censorship is caused the groupthink as one of the factors. And so should we prevent the group things? Here's an article which talk about how to kill groupthink in your company. One I will recommend is something I call it play the devil's advocate, which means you will appoint an individual or a subgroup to come up with the opposite ideas or idea against the current proposal on the table. We call it play the devil's advocate. Just force someone to think negatively about what has been proposed. And this is to some extent, similar to the so-called pro and cons list. Any alternative in your decision-making process should be evaluated by lists of the pros and cons, so people can judge the alternative fairly. There are quite a few decision-making technique or tool including software tool. Nominal group technique, that's a group technique. Delphi survey or technique. In terms of decision-making, use majority rule, which means each vote from a member are weighted equally. Building consensus, managing conflict or resolve conflict, and use more analytical tool like decision tree, simulation, statistic to help us to make decision are well accepted, and particularly in the era of big data. Using machine learning tool, deep learning tool can be also quite useful, but certainly much higher level of technology may be involved. Use decision support system, and also just try to use something like sales scenario manager, which can be a simple decision-making tool to help you to evaluate various alternatives under different scenarios. And in terms of system, group decision support system, so-called GDSS, is a collection of tools which can help the group making decisions. Just use nominal group technique. If you look at the 5 stages that people go through in conducting nominal group technique, it's very similar to the rational decision making or creative problem solving. You make introduction, explanation, and then you silently generate of ideas. You don't have to vocally doing the brainstorming. People write it in when we say silent generation of idea, people write on a piece of paper the idea they have, and each one of them have to come up with their own list. And then you pass that list around after you finish this idea generation. So people may share the idea, and eventually you have a group discussion of the idea being proposed. And then you take a vote and rank the alternative to come up with much shorter list such that it can be useful for you. Last but not the least, we should follow the quality cycle or Deming's cycle, which is plan, do, check, and act. And during planning or even doing or executing and checking, we always are making decisions. And the act is where we should use the opportunity to review the decision we have made, review the decision-making process model that we follow, and see whether there's any room for improvement. And we can summarize the experience as a lesson learned, or put it in the context of a learning organization to see whether you have enough room for improvement. You continuously improve the decision-making technique skill that you have acquired, and also improve the decision-making processes. Okay, that's it. This concludes our discussion on a very important topic called decision making. And by the way, this is a Asian Chinese chess called Go, and it's just black and white pieces, and then you would kind of try to occupy space on the chessboard. The more space you occupy, then you win. What happened is, particular for professional champion competitions, sometimes we'll have experts who will go through each move by the two components and then review what's their rationale for such move or for such decision making. And this is an example of review decisions in terms of chess game. We can do the same thing for our decision, for our strategic planning, etc. Okay, that's it. Thank you for listening. Bye bye.